à long terme. Our friendship in the Middle East with Israel, of course, it's deep and it's permanent. It transcends, I would remind Mr. Harper, and I say it over again to insist on this point, it transcends partisan differences. That friendship in no way means that we can be indifferent to the Palestinian claim to a viable state which is on the verge of being formed in the other half of the old British Mandate of Palestine. Canada should be supporting it. We should be showing leadership in expressing what it will take to get there. It will need, of course, to be a country committed to democracy and committed to human rights, but it will also need to be viable with the capacity to build a strong economy and hope for its people. Canada needs to be constructively present behind the scenes, as deeply engaged as we were in 1948, in 1956, in 1967, in 1973, and at so many other critical points along the way. That's the Canadian tradition. That's the vitality of Canadian foreign policy. Discussing Canada's role and commitments in Afghanistan. We went there as part of a NATO and United Nations effort to create a more stable country after a quarter century of civil war, Russian occupation, and Taliban rule, and in particular to allow for the creation of a democratic government after the Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to use Afghanistan as a training ground for terrorism and as a training ground for the attack on the World Trade Center. Al-Qaeda launched the attack on the World Trade Center, and the world had no choice but to respond. I would hope that all parties, including the New Democratic Party, all parties, would recognize the simple truth of that statement. Canada's work in Afghanistan has been difficult. Nearly 100 Canadian men and women have lost their lives, and thousands of Afghan civilians and troops from other countries have been killed as well. The road to peace and to stability is proving to be an enormous challenge. There would seem to be two major errors to be avoided. The first would be to think that there is a simple military solution to the conflict. We are not in Afghanistan to impose anything on anyone. We are there to answer a cry for peace and justice to which we cannot be indifferent as Canadians. But we must always remember that it is ultimately the Afghan people and their neighbors who must find their way to stability. The second mistake would be to abandon the Afghan people to the forces of extremism before their government and their army and their police are ready to assume greater responsibility for the future. C'est pour cela que nous avons pressé le Parlement de se réunir et de redéfinir la mission du Canada en Afghanistan, qui, jusqu'en 2011, privilégiera les interventions diplomatiques et humanitaires, mettre nos troupes au service de ces efforts et se concentrera sur la formation des forces armées et de police de l'Afghanistan. M. Harper, évidemment, a dit récemment au Québec qu'il allait accepter la date d'échéance de 2011 pour mettre un terme à notre intervention militaire en Afghanistan. Mais il faut se souvenir que M. Harper a aussi fait des autres engagements. Par exemple, il s'était aussi engagé à tenir les élections générales à date fixe au Canada. Les prochaines étaient en départ prévues pour 2009. Mr. Harper said he was ready to pull the troops out in 2011. He announced it in Quebec. But let's not forget that Mr. Harper is also the person who told us very solemnly in the House of Commons that the date of the election was going to be in 2009. Last time I looked, we're a year early. It's only the Liberals that have the team, I believe, that can effectively lead us in the direction we need to go. It's become very clear to all of us that Mr. Harper doesn't have a team. I would argue they don't even have a captain. He has a mirror for a cabinet. Stephen Harper, who would have taken us into Iraq, as we've seen, on the basis of somebody else's exaggerated rhetoric, is not the man who is going to lead us out of Afghanistan in a military fashion by 2011. Nor is the man who has cut funds for public diplomacy and culture capable of understanding what it will really take to curb fanaticism in the world. This is not primarily a military conflict. It's a conflict about values. It's a conflict about culture. It's a conflict about ending fanaticism and ending those deep forces. It's important to remember that when it was suggested to Winston Churchill that London's theatres should be closed during the war, he refused. And he said, "What else are we fighting for?" John Kennedy said, and I'm quoting, I don't know why I have to keep saying I'm quoting, I guess it's just something on my mind. John Kennedy said, and I quote, "Art is the great democrat, calling forth creative genius from every sector of society, disregarding race or religion or wealth or color. If art is to nourish the roots of our culture, society must set the artist free to follow his vision wherever it takes him. We must never forget that art is not a form of propaganda. It is a form of truth." Stephen Harper, au contraire, dit que personne ne se soucie des artistes ni de la culture et qui ne sont pas importants. Stéphane et les libéraux disent que c'est justement pour défendre nos valeurs et nos intérêts que nous nous engageons dans le monde. If I may coin a phrase, Stephen Harper, not up to the job. Only the Liberals have the experience, the depth, the broad commitment, and the understanding to do this job which Canadians want done. The Liberal Party of Pearson, Trudeau, Turner, Chrétien, Martin, and Stéphane Dion is there for Canadians to get our voice back again. We are there for Canadians to build a country once again that will set a standard for the world. We are there for Canadians to make us proud. Thank you very much.
Quite happy to take several minutes of question and answer. First from the audience, if we could please, and I leave it to Bob to take those questions. So from the audience first, please.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Rae. As we know that foreign policy can make you or break you, as Mr. Rae said. But there is a serious problem in the foreign policy. It's a systematic problem. Especially if you look at the Canadian embassy outside, the system is broken. So what are you going to do to fix this? Because this is the step or the baby step in fixing the foreign policy. Thank you.
Well, you're right, it's a real challenge. It's a practical problem, and obviously couldn't touch on everything in the speech for not wanting to take up your entire morning. But one of the things that's disturbed me most is that how we do things, how we organize ourselves, is no longer as effective. And Mr. Harper, for example, I've never seen morale in the Canadian Foreign Service, the Canadian Public Service, as low as it is today. I've just never seen anything like it. You talk to people who are working there, they feel intimidated, they feel their ideas are not